Hello, everyone, and welcome to another X's and Dogs podcast. Today we have kind of a dry Browns news week in general, so we're going to be talking a lot about college football. I also thought it was a good time to go into another mock draft. You know, after the Steelers win, I think it really shakes things up with the Browns draft, and I've talked about that a couple times since the win. But I do think it's a necessary thing to do to make another mock draft and kind of reflect where the Browns are currently, even though there is still a ton of information still to come out regarding the who's going to be making the decisions in the draft, exactly where the Browns are going to be picking, etc. Now, I want to start today's podcast, though, by talking about the college football games that we all watched over the past couple of days, so New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, starting with the Ohio State game. And if you guys did tune into my podcast earlier in the week, I mentioned how I thought Miami would give Ohio State trouble in this game. And I think that did play or come into fruition. And there's a couple main reasons why that happened. For all of you Ohio State fans, I'm sure you are well aware of this. But my take on the game was that Miami is good enough defensively up front, so you know they can rush the passer with four guys, led by Ruben Bain, who had a monster game in this one and probably solidified himself as top 10, maybe a top 5 draft pick, depending on how the board falls, depending on where teams are picking. But Miami is good enough to rush for and get pressure on pretty much any college football team. And add on top of that, Ohio State is dealing and has been dealing with a pretty banged up offensive line in general. Really, you know, over the past month or latter half of the college football season. And I think, you know, you add those two things to an equation and it just results in a really challenging day for the Ohio State offense, and you had to rely on Julian Sayin to bail you out on numerous occasions, and I thought he was able to do that sometimes, but overall, he made a couple very costly errors in this game, and the bottom line is that Julian Sayin is a freshman quarterback, and that was something else that I was taking into consideration when thinking about this game. You know, Carson Beck, while not a world beater, I don't think any of us will argue that Carson Beck is this fantastic college quarterback and can one day be a pro or anything like that. But, you know, he's a guy who had already played in numerous big time games for Georgia. You know, whenever you're playing for an SEC team like Georgia, you have huge games almost every week. You're playing Alabama. You're playing LSU, you're playing Tennessee, you're playing all these teams, and I think Julian Sayin, in comparison, really had only played in a couple big games this year. You know, the Michigan game, the Indiana game. I don't think in either one of those he was fully content with his performance. So then you get put into this game against a fantastic defensive front, very physical team, who's one of the only teams in the country that can truly out-physical you on just a man-to-man basis at the line of scrimmage. You know, and you're playing also up against a very experienced quarterback, and I just think that was the story of the game. An experienced quarterback versus an inexperienced quarterback, and also a fantastic, probably the best defensive line in college football going up against banged up Ohio State offensive line that still is pretty good, but you know, whenever you're facing that team, you have to be really, really good on the offensive line in order to keep your quarterback upright. And Ohio State wasn't able to do so, and I think that's the reason why they lost the game. It was just too much destruction, too much mayhem that the Miami defensive line was able to kind of create for that Ohio State offense to be able to have any sort of sustained drives, score any consistent points. You know, they had 0 points in the first half. You can blame the kicker all you want, but the fact of the matter is that Ohio State offensively was not good enough in this game, and it costed them. So, it was a good football game. It was fun to watch. I thought both teams were highly competitive, which is not something that you can say about all of the games we watched over the past couple days. I really thought Texas Tech and Alabama were unprepared for the moment. They looked like they didn't belong in their respective games. Not to take anything away from Oregon and Indiana, who are going to play each other next week in what I think will be a fantastic game. They already played a fantastic game earlier in the year, but those Texas Tech and Alabama really just appeared to be very much outmatched by those two squads. So obviously those weren't the best games, but last night was a fantastic game as well. Georgia and Ole Miss. I fully expected Georgia to be able to win this game. I thought, not having Lane Kiffin and just kind of all the drama that's going on with Ole Miss was going to play a role in this game. And they were able to get their first playoff win last week. And I thought that was just going to be the end of the road for them, but they played fantastic. Trinidad had a really, really good game. I don't think he's NFL quarterback worthy, but he's a very fun college player. That's a good Ole Miss team. That's going to be a really good game between Ole Miss and Miami next week. And I think we're set up for two very good semifinal games and probably a very good championship game. I'll have my picks later on next week before those games actually happen. But overall, I thought there was two good games and two kind of stinker games. That's kind of the way this thing works in the college football playoffs. But, it was fun to watch regardless. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it with family and friends. Hopefully you guys had a great new year. Otherwise, but yeah, as far as Browns news goes this week, there was some information coming out with potential guys being interviewed in for I don't believe Browns general manager positions. I believe more assistant type positions. I don't really think it's anything too important to talk about. I'm someone who's been open on this podcast saying that I think Andrew Berry is coming back. I would be shocked if Andrew Berry is fired. I think all of the tea leaves have kind of pointed us in the direction that Andrew Berry will be back. Is that the right move? I'm kind of 50-50 with it. I tend to lean in the direction that a total cleansing of anybody involved in the organization right now would be better. But, I think Jimmy Haslam recognizes kind of the cap situation that the team is in, recognizes that Andrew Berry, had a fantastic draft this past draft, and also recognizes that it's going to be hard to find a general manager worth giving a shot to be willing to take this Browns job with the current situation. And I think he's going to more than likely just give Andrew Berry the chance to pick a new head coach, and I'm sure that process has already started, although, we have no idea. I'm sure they in the building know what's going to happen with the head coach already. And I think Andrew Berry is going to get another shot at this. That's my gut feeling on the situation. Like my gut feeling is that Kevin Stefanski wouldn't return for another year. But apart from that, I think the only other real Browns news to go over this week is that more than likely we're not going to see Carson Schweschinger, Harold Fannin, and there's a third individual who is out, who I'm blanking on right now. But there's some definite notable injuries, and we're going into the last week of the season. In a season, the Browns are playing meaningless games, so I think they're probably going to be really reluctant to play these guys this week against the Bengals. Myles Garrett was dealing with a little bit of something, but it seems like he's going to be playing, and I'm sure if he's able to walk, he'll be in this one because he's looking to break that sack record. And I'll wrap up today's podcast talking about the Bengals game, but I do want to shift into kind of the mock draft idea for the next little bit of this podcast. And, I want to preface the mock draft today by normally I don't do my mock drafts with any sort of trades because it's really hard to predict, who's going to trade where, what general managers are willing to trade a pick. Some teams are just, you on these hypothetical mock drafts, you can say you're going to trade with team X, Y, and Z, but in reality, there's a good chance team X, Y, and Z has no interest in trading up or trading down. So it's just really hard to predict those things, and most time I'll just avoid that in my mock drafts. Now, as I pull up the mock draft here, you will see I did make a trade back in this scenario, and I wanted to make the trade back more so to hone in on the point that I find the talent in this draft, once you get past, the two quarterbacks at the top, Arvell Reese, probably Caleb Downs up there as well. Maybe you could throw Ruben Bain in that class. Maybe you could throw Sonny Styles up there. You get some of these guys who are really good defensive players apart from the quarterback. But looking at it from an offensive standpoint, I think Jeremiah Love is a guy who is talented enough to go that early, but I don't think is going to go that early because he plays the running back position. But apart from, Jeremiah Love, I find that the picks from the range of 3 to 10 to 15, anywhere in that range, you're really overdrafting on these guys. And it's just one of those drafts because similar to last season, I felt there was I felt Will Campbell was a tackle who you could draft early last year. Obviously, Travis Hunter was a player who could be drafted early, but apart from like a couple guys, there wasn't like that next tier of legitimate people or players who could go, who fit going, in the range of 3 to 10. And I think it's a similar situation this year, especially on the offensive side of the ball. There is some more talent, high-end talent defensively, but the Browns are a team who just invested a ton of capital, a ton of draft capital in 2025 defensively. The top 2 picks for this team were 2 defensive players. And I don't think after having the putrid offensive season that we've had, not only this year, but last year too, this team can afford to pass up on more offensive players early in this draft. So knowing that, that's kind of my mindset on trading back. And I think the Browns are going to be faced with 2 options here. First off, trade up. Use the 2 first-round picks this year. Ideally, you wouldn't have to throw another first-rounder in there. Ideally, you could get away with like another second or 2 seconds to move up and get the quarterback, more than likely being Dante Moore, because, I think his resume is building and he's playing really well still. I know there was some controversy about his performance against Texas Tech, but I thought he played a really efficient game, did what the Oregon offense asked him to do. I was not a fan of the play calling in that game. I think also some bad snaps really took Oregon's chances away from scoring a lot of points, particularly in the first half. And if you kind of get rid of that, I think more than likely Oregon has more points. Maybe Dante Moore has a touchdown or 2, more yards, etc. So I thought he played really well. He only had 6 incompletions, went 27 of 33 in that game. And he's to me, looks like a first-round quarterback. And I would be willing to trade up for him. I'm not sure the Browns are going to do that. Who knows? But I think that's one of their options. The other option would be to, in my opinion, to trade back, because you're sitting there at probably pick 5, 6, or 7, depending on where the cards fall this week, in the last game of the season. But I just don't think that there's going to be a player that is truly valuable enough offensively to take there. And I think that more than likely, either one of a few things can happen. First off, a team is going to really want Caleb Downs because he's fantastic. But the thing is, he plays safety, and the Browns in their current structure cannot afford to draft a safety this high. I tweeted the other day that, adding Caleb Downs to this team and with the way the defense is built sounds super enticing. But realistically speaking, there's no way the Browns can pick Caleb. They don't have the luxury to take a safety at this point. And I think a team that does have the luxury to do that, whether it be, in this particular mock draft, the Bengals were willing to trade up and they drafted him at number 6. So, maybe it's the Bengals. Maybe it's, you name a team that has the offense and the franchise quarterback who's able to compete but doesn't have the defense they need. Maybe even the Chiefs. So I think a team will probably be willing to trade up to get Caleb Downs. Or if it's not Caleb Downs, maybe a team falls in love with Carnell Tate. Me personally, I am not fully bought in on Carnell Tate to use a top 10 draft pick on. If he was there with the later first round pick, 100%, I'm on board to take him there. Now, I just don't think he has shown enough to be one of those guys who you can count on, without a doubt, to be a wide receiver 1 for your football team going forward. And if you're going to use a top 10 pick on a wide receiver, you need him to be that. And that's kind of my mindset on Carnell Tate and just kind of, honestly, most of the wide receivers in this draft class. Jordan Tyson's a very talented guy too, but he's had some injury history that's quite threatening to, I think, most football teams in the NFL are going to be a little put off by that. And with that, I'm not sure I would use a top 10 pick on him either. Similar with Jordan Tyson, if he's there later, absolutely, we'll take him with that pick in the 20s from the Jags, but I can't get myself to take him at that 5 or 6 spot, 5, 6, or 7 spot, I should say. And maybe a team disagrees with the Browns, and maybe the Chiefs get overly aggressive because they need a wide receiver 1, or maybe the Bills the Bills will be picking really low, but I think the Chiefs are a really good landing spot. One of these teams is kind of in that pick 10 range that needs a wide receiver 1, really wants a wide receiver 1, is willing to trade up, give a second round pick to get Carnell Tate or Jordan Tyson or, like I said before, Caleb Downs. I think that's a real possibility, and I think that's the other option for the Browns. So you're going to trade up or you're going to trade down because you're trying to work the draft board in a way where you feel comfortable drafting a player based on their value at that spot. Now, that's the way I look at it. I'm pretty sure that's the way Andrew Berry looks at it. And I'm pretty confident if Andrew Berry is making the pick that he's going to be considering all options, and all of those options, and included in all of those options is trading up or trading down. So that kind of explains the first pick. Now, I go offensive tackle, wide receiver, offensive tackle with the first 3 picks here. And I think that is more than likely the best way to approach positionally the draft here. I'm higher on Caleb Lomu than I am Spencer Fano. It's kind of a preference call there. Both the Utah guys are really good and have pretty high ceilings. I tend to think Caleb Lomu has a higher ceiling than Fanu, but if you're a guy who thinks otherwise, you can make that argument. I think Caleb Lomu is going to be a fantastic tackle in the NFL. I think taking him at 10 makes a lot of sense. Taking him at 5 or 6 it feels like a little bit of a reach to me. And I know it's not much lower, but if you can trade back and have one of those guys on the board still there, I think that's 100% worth it. And that's kind of my mind, the way my mind went about this trade. Like, I think those players one of those players are still going to be on the board at 10, 11, 12, 13, wherever you trade back. And you can more than likely just take him there, avoid taking him at 5 or 6, and also get, some more draft capital to work with later on in this particular draft, which, I was able to get the second round pick in this mock. No, I mean Chris Bell. I'm just really high on Chris Bell. I think he's fantastic. I think if it wasn't for his injury, he would be a guy similar to Denzel Boston, who is projected to be a pick in the 20s range. I think this 27 is a little bit of a reach for Chris Bell, and I will say that if Denzel Boston is available, and I think he will be available there, in reality, that's probably the better selection. But it was more of a process of just taking a wide receiver there with the late 20s pick, and Chris Bell was my favorite on the board still. Everybody else had already gotten selected. Carnell Tate, Jordan Tyson, Lemon, and Denzel Boston were all already off the board, and I do like Chris Bell. I think he's the start of the tier after those four guys. But I still think he can be a really good player in the NFL if he's able to bounce back from that injury well. Austin Sierreveld, I'm also really high on. Doesn't have a ton of experience, but has shown he's a very, very strong tackle. Very aggressive hands. He's a guy who I think there's a chance he'll be a guard. I talked about him in the last mock more in depth, but even if he's a guy who shifts to the guard position, you're drafting Caleb Lomu in this mock draft earlier anyway. So having the guard help there and a guy who has the ability to potentially play tackle as well, I think it has the potential to be an upside type pick there. And, I think Sierreveld is a guy who's just going to work really hard and be a great pro as well. Now the next pick, this was a spot where I just didn't see value in any offensive player to pick at 41. I think once you get into the 40s, you're really looking at defensive players, because all of those offensive tackles that are kind of the second tier behind Lomu and Fano, are probably off the board. The wide receivers who you would be comfortable drafting there are probably off the board as well. So I thought, McNeil Warren's a guy who played in the MAC at Toledo, and he's a freak athlete, great frame, 6'2". I think he has really high upside to be, a potential Kyle Hamilton-like safety who's able to do a ton of things for you. You can send him on a blitz. He tackles really well. He's not the best in route coverage, you can definitely scheme some things up on him, but obviously that's the part of his game that can grow. I think he has the foundation to be fantastic in the NFL, and I think he's a first round talent that's probably going to go in the second round just because he plays safety, and I'm willing to take him here at 41 because there's just not the offensive talent on the board at this moment was not worth passing up on the player that McNeil Warren can potentially be for a team that does need a safety in the Browns. Now, the next two picks were kind of just positional selections. Cade Piper's a guy who I think he's a redshirt sophomore at Iowa. I think he's only played this year, and I want to say they're even I think he's still debating going back to Iowa for another year. I don't believe he's confirmed coming out in the draft, and I honestly think there's a good chance he will go back to Iowa. I also read that potentially he could play center for them. So, I think picking a guard at this spot is more the idea here. Whoever it may be, I think the third round becomes the sweet spot for the guard position in this draft, because there's a lot of guys to choose from there, and that's kind of where I was going here. Just pick a guard. Who knows who I haven't done a ton of research into the guards in this draft class, if I'm being honest with you guys. I'll do more of that kind of as we move into the off season for sure, to get a better idea in later mock drafts. Similar thing with the edge. I will say Dennis Sutton's a guy who, going into the season could have been, he had a really high ceiling. He was a guy who, a lot of people said could be a first or second round pick, and had a little bit of a down year. I think having Abdul Carter on the team last year really helped him at Penn State, but I still think he can be a pretty productive player. And in the 4th round, I'm 100% willing to take kind of a gamble on a defensive player. And the idea here is that if Andrew Berry's making the picks, he's going to mix some defensive guys in. Like, I don't want you Browns fans to get into your minds that Andrew Berry is going to just only draft offensive players, because you're going to be disappointed if that's kind of the mindset you have. Andrew Berry is very, very he follows the idea of best player available strictly. And, similar thing with McNeil Warren and with that 2nd round pick there. Like, he's gonna want these guys who are great values, regardless of if the positional need isn't fully there. So, I think as a fan base, we do need to accept that we're probably there's going to be a couple draft picks that you're thinking, we don't even need that position. Like, why are we wasting a pick on that? Well, that's just kind of the way Andrew Berry works. And, it has its pluses, it has its minuses. I think at times it works, and at times you kind of look silly with some of these picks. So that's kind of the way I did the mock draft. I'm not saying this is necessarily the way I would go about it. I probably would just continue to take offensive linemen, particularly with the 4th round pick. But I definitely wouldn't anticipate that being what does happen in reality. So, that does wrap up the mock draft. This isn't I'm not going to lie to you guys. I can't say that I'm thrilled by these 6 players on the screen right now. Obviously, I think in particular, like the Chris Bell pick, ideally we get one of those first 4 wide receivers, and we don't have to get Chris Bell in the 1st round. But, in this mock draft, none of those guys were available, so I just took the wide receiver to kind of represent the position. And similar thing with Saravel too, like the tackle out of Clemson, I think would probably be, what's his name? Is it Blake? Is it something Miller? I think he'll probably be available there as well. He's had a really good year this year on a bad Clemson team. So I think he's more than likely going to be there at 39. Who knows? We don't even know if the pick's going to for sure be 39. It could be higher, and in which case, maybe you can get a more solidified tackle there who's played more college football than Saravel. But, if you do have to pick Saravel in that spot, I'm content. And I think he has the potential to offer you the tackle and guard position for the next 5 to 10 years, which is fantastic. So let me know what you guys think about this mock draft. Posted on Twitter, got mixed feedback. Some of you aren't a fan of some of these guys. Some of you were like, yeah, like this is the way I would go about it too. I think the most important takeaway in this mock is the avoidance of just taking a player in the 3 to 10 pick range. I think if the Browns can avoid doing that, so either trading up or trading down, which I've alluded to frequently today, that's the best case scenario, in my opinion, the way the draft board kind of falls this year. Let me know what you guys think about that. Maybe you disagree strongly. Maybe you think Carnell Tate's just a fantastic value pick there at 5 or 6. I'm not on board with that just yet, but he still has to go through his pro day, and maybe he runs a better 40 time than I'm expecting, and he's has the rare athleticism that I don't necessarily anticipate him having quite yet, but we'll see where that goes. And maybe you think Jordan Tyson's one of those guys too. It's just, I'm not on board with those guys yet, but if you are, I'll hear you out on it. Now, I do want to shift the attention from the mock draft, and again, I will have more mock drafts out to you guys as we progress along the off season, closer and closer to the draft. I'll probably do, I'd say, like 3 more kind of as milestones go by and we have more information, and able to be a little bit more accurate with my particular selections. But for the game this weekend, there really are, as has been the situation for the better part of the last month. There really are only a couple things that Browns fans are really going to be watching in this one. First one's Myles Garrett. Now, I was really disappointed that he wasn't able to break the sack record in the 16 games, because now we have to deal with all the conversation about, all these guys got this amount of sacks in less games than Myles Garrett, which, if you look at the numbers, the number of passing downs this Browns defense has faced in general is miles less, no pun intended, miles less than these other guys who Myles is competing with in the sack record competition. So, like, the number of games to me is kind of irrelevant, but just in the whole argument, it's going to be annoying to have to deal with that. But regardless of that, we all want Myles Garrett to get a couple more sacks in this game, solidify their record, and then some. I think he's going to do it. I think that the Bengals offense is just not going to do what Pittsburgh did, where they're getting the ball out in 1 second and not giving and just playing to avoid the sack. They asked Joe Burrow about that this week, and he said, sometimes the sack is just a better negative outcome in comparison to other negative outcomes like interception or fumble or etc. So, Joe Burrow was honest in saying, he's not going to play this game to be just purely avoiding the sack record and avoiding Myles. And they never do, because Myles is always able to get sacks when he plays the Bengals. And I think can't really name a better team to play in the last game here when you need to get a sack. So, yeah, we'll be watching for that. We're also going to be watching, obviously, Shedeur Sanders. I made a tweet earlier this week talking about how I really believe that it's important for Shedeur Sanders to end the season on a positive note. And here's what I mean by that. If we go back to last year, for example, Joe Milton played for the Patriots and had a really good game. I think he threw a couple touchdowns and almost 300 yards. And there was legitimate clamoring by fan bases out there to trade a third or second round pick to get Joe Milton. It didn't end up happening. I think he went to Dallas, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe for a third or fourth round pick. But there was legitimate conversation around the fact that you could trade assets to go out there and get Joe Milton whenever he only played one game and had a good game. Now, Shedeur, we've seen a greater sample size. I'm not going to say necessarily better, but he's already played a really good game against Tennessee. And I think if he's able to play a fantastic game this week where, he has a couple or a few touchdowns, over 200, 250 yards, looks really efficient, more importantly, doesn't turn the ball over like he's been doing, I think that's going to go a long way in, Jimmy Haslam's mind, as far as if Jimmy believes he can be the quarterback next season. Because the fact of the matter is this: if I had to give you my honest answer on if I believe that Jimmy Haslam has his mind made up on Shedeur Sanders yet for next year, I would tell you no. I think Jimmy does not know yet. And, adding another very successful game for Shedeur is simply going to add to the data that Jimmy Haslam has in support of Shedeur potentially being an answer for next year. And I think that's very important. And I think also the NFL is one of those leagues where it's, what have you done for me recently? There's recently bias everywhere in the league. And if you go into the offseason where, Shedeur has one of these really good games, I think it's going to be on the forefront of not only the Browns fans' minds, but Jimmy Haslam's mind. And we know Jimmy Haslam can be kind of prisoner of the moment. So I think Shedeur has a really good opportunity against not a great defense and an even worse passing defense to have a good game. Neither team is necessarily playing for anything, so that de-escalates all the pressure. If he can go out there and be really efficient, not turn the ball over, score a lot of points, I think he's going to just do himself a lot of good, assuming he's able to do that. And I think that's something else we're watching. So, that's kind of the two parts of the back end of the season here that everyone has their eyes on, and it's certainly no different this week. We'll cover it all with you guys in the post-game show for sure. Only other thing is, if the Browns do lose, they can potentially get back in the top 5. They're kind of relying on some other really bad teams to win some games. And, none of those teams are really going to be interested in doing so. They have an outside shot of getting back to pick like 3 and 4. I think most likely it's going to be 5, 6, or 7 based on the games that are being played, the teams that are resting guys, etc. But, I'm not really even too worried about that at this point. At the end of the day, the Browns are going to have to trade up if they want a quarterback, and otherwise, I think it's in their best interest to trade down. I will say, though, if they get the 3rd or 4th pick, you have more of a potential to trade down because teams are really going to want Arvell Reese because teams really want pass rushers. So, like, if you're in a position where you can use him as leverage, I think you'll be able to increase the assets you can get in return. But I'm really not too worried about that at this point. That kind of all went out the window once they beat the Steelers last week. So, we're watching Shador and we're watching Miles in this one. Hopefully everyone's able to enjoy the last game of the season. The offseason, everyone's always excited to get to the offseason, but then it really just feels so long when you're going through all these months without football. So just try to soak in the last week. And then we'll obviously get to watch the playoffs, which the Browns aren't going to be in, but it does suck for the season to end. But it should be a very important and I'm sure exciting offseason with a ton of Browns news because it always seems to be that way. It seems to be the Browns organization. Their true on season is the times where the Browns don't play football and there's the eternal fountain of hope for us Browns fans with the draft and free agency and stuff. But anyways, guys, hopefully you enjoy the game. Hopefully you have a great weekend. I'll talk to you guys on Sunday after the game. Take care. Bye-bye.